It was Christmas Eve, and I was driving home late. The roads were quiet, blanketed in fresh snow that sparkled under the glow of my headlights. A soft Christmas carol played on the radio, but I barely heard it. I was tired and just wanted to be home with a warm drink in my bed. The road ahead was dark, cutting through a stretch of forest. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. I gripped the wheel tightly, keeping my eyes on the narrow, slippery road. As I turned a corner, my headlights caught something up ahead. A car was parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing. At first I thought it might be abandoned, but as I got closer, I noticed the driver's side door was slightly open. I slowed down and stopped a few feet behind it. My breath fogged up the windshield as I stared at the car. It was a small sedan, dark blue, with no visible damage. I couldn't see anyone inside. I rolled down my window, letting the icy wind rush in. "Hello?" I called out. My voice felt swallowed by the empty night. No answer. For a moment, I thought about driving away. It was late, and I wasn't sure I wanted to get involved. But what if someone needed help? Maybe their car broke down, and they'd gone to find a phone signal or a gas station. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box and stepped out of my car. The cold bit into my skin as the snow crunched under my boots. I walked toward the car, shining the light inside. The interior was empty. No bags, no phone, no keys in the ignition. "Hello," I called again, louder this time. My voice echoed back at me from the trees. Still no response. The snow around the car was undisturbed, no footprints leading away. That struck me as odd. If someone had left the car, there should have been tracks in the fresh snow. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I turned back toward my car, ready to leave. This wasn't my problem. But then, as I reached my door, I froze. In the faint glow of my taillights, I saw a set of footprints. They weren't there when I stopped. I was sure of it. The prints led from the woods to the back of my car, circling around it. My heart pounded. I swung the flashlight around, scanning the trees. The beam bounced off trunks and branches, but I didn't see anyone. "Is someone there?" I shouted. No answer. I fumbled to open my car door, glancing over my shoulder. The road was still empty, the forest quiet. I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors. My hands shook as I started the engine. As I pulled back onto the road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The parked car disappeared behind me, swallowed by the darkness. I told myself I was just imagining things, that the footprints could have been there all along, and I just hadn't noticed. But then, as I turned onto the highway, I saw headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Another car heading home, like me. But as I drove, I noticed the headlights were following me too closely. I sped up a little, but the car matched my speed. My stomach twisted. I tapped the brakes lightly, hoping they'd back off, but instead, the headlights blinked on and off, flashing at me. Panic set in. Was this the person from the parked car? Had they been hiding in the woods, waiting for someone like me to stop? I pressed the gas pedal, my tires skidding slightly on the icy road. The car behind me did the same, its engine roaring as it closed the distance. "Leave me alone," I yelled, though no one could hear me. I thought about calling the police, but my phone was in my bag, out of reach. My fingers gripped the wheel as I tried to think of what to do. Up ahead, I saw a gas station. Its bright lights spilled onto the road, a beacon in the dark. Without hesitation, I turned sharply into the parking lot and stopped near the pumps. The car behind me didn't follow. It slowed on the road, its headlights shining into the gas station for a moment before speeding off into the night. I sat there for a long time, my heart racing. The attendant inside the station gave me a curious look, but I didn't care. I wasn't ready to get out of the car just yet. When I finally felt calm enough to drive again, I stayed on well-lit roads and kept glancing in my mirrors. But the rest of the way home was uneventful. That night, as I sat in my living room with a blanket wrapped around me, I couldn't stop thinking about the stranger in the snow. Who were they? What did they want? I never found out. But every Christmas Eve since, I've avoided that road. And I never ever stopped for cars on the side of the road. It was 10 years ago, on a Christmas Eve I'll never forget. I was living alone back then, in a little one-story house at the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was home. The streets were quiet that night. the snow falling in thick, lazy flakes, muffling every sound. I'd spent the evening the same way I had every year, wrapping last-minute gifts, eating a bit too much chocolate, and watching an old Christmas movie. The house was warm, cozy, and smelled faintly of pine from the small tree I'd decorated in the corner of the living room. By midnight, I was ready to call it a night. I switched off the lights, leaving only the glow of the tree, and headed to bed. The snowfall outside had picked up, and I could hear the soft whisper of wind brushing against the windows. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me, not at first. It was something else, a feeling. The kind that creeps up your spine like you're being watched. I lay there for a moment, listening. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of settling wood. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it. A soft thud. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, like something or someone walking across the roof. I sat up, heart pounding. It's probably just snow sliding off, I whispered to myself, though I didn't quite believe it. The sound didn't match the light, powdery snow that had been falling all night. I got out of bed and crept to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The yard was empty, untouched, except for the thick blanket of snow. But something about the quiet didn't feel right. Then I saw them. Boot prints. They started in the middle of the yard, far from any road or walkway leading directly to the side of my house. My stomach twisted. Who would be out here in the middle of the night walking through my yard? I grabbed my phone and flicked on the flashlight app, pointing it toward the tracks. The beam of light traced the path of the prints, and my blood ran cold. They weren't just in the yard, they went up the side of the house as if someone had climbed the wall. The thud came again, directly above me this time. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Who the hell climbs onto someone's roof in the middle of the night? My first thought was a prank, but this didn't feel like a joke. It felt wrong. I dialed 911, my fingers trembling. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's on my roof, I whispered, glancing toward the ceiling. I don't know who it is, but there are boot prints leading up the side of my house. The operator's voice was calm, but firm. Stay on the line. Officers are on their way. Do you have a safe place to go? I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I think so. I'm in my bedroom. Stay there. Don't go outside, and don't confront anyone. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the faint creaks above me. Every sound felt louder, heavier. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing. No footsteps, no scraping, just the soft howl of the wind outside. The sound stopped, I whispered to the operator. Officers are 2 minutes away, she replied. I stayed frozen, gripping the phone tightly until I saw the flash of red and blue lights outside. A knock came at the door moments later, and I nearly ran to answer it. 2 officers stood on the porch, their boots already dusted with snow. We'll take a look around, one of them said, stepping past me into the house. The other stayed outside, shining a flashlight up at the roof. Footprints up here, he called out. My chest tightened. Hadn't imagined it. Someone had been up there. The officers swept the house and yard but didn't find anyone. Tracks lead into the woods, one of them said. Could have been a prowler, maybe someone trying to break in and got spooked. But why the roof? I asked, my voice shaking. He shrugged. Some people are just weird. They left after making sure everything was secure, and I locked every door and window twice. But I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, as the sun rose and melted away some of my fear, I went outside to inspect the tracks myself. The boot prints were still there, leading up the side of the house. I followed them, my breath visible in the cold air, until I reached the corner where they started, and that's when I saw it. There was a single boot print in the snow, far larger than any human foot I'd ever seen. It was pressed deep into the ground, as if whoever or whatever had left it was impossibly heavy. I stepped back, my heart racing again. The police had called it a prowler, but I never believed that. Prowlers don't leave tracks like those. It's been 10 years, and I still think about that Christmas Eve. Every snowfall, every creak of the roof brings me back to that night. I still don't know who or what visited me, but I do know one thing. I never leave my curtains open anymore. It was Christmas Eve, and I had just finished tucking my kids into bed. Sarah, my 8-year-old, had left cookies and milk for Santa on the coffee table, while Timmy, only 5, insisted on hanging an extra stocking just in case Santa brought a friend. The house was quiet now, except for the soft hum of the furnace working against the biting cold outside. Snow had been falling steadily all evening, blanketing the neighborhood in a serene white stillness. I stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the empty street. It was picture perfect. After a long day of holiday prep, I still had one last task: assembling the kids' Christmas gifts. I set up shop in the living room, armed with a toolkit, wrapping paper, and instructions for a dollhouse and a toy truck. I switched on some Christmas music for company and got to work. The first hour passed uneventfully, though I cursed under my breath more than once at the tiny screws and poorly written instructions. Around midnight, I got up to stretch and grab a cup of coffee. That's when I noticed it, the faintest sound of footsteps above me. I froze, straining my ears. The kids' bedrooms were upstairs, and I just checked on them a half hour ago. Sarah was snoring lightly, and Timmy was curled up with his stuffed bear. Maybe one of them was up for a drink of water? But as I listened, the footsteps didn't seem to move toward the bathroom. They were slow, deliberate, almost heavy. "Sarah? Timmy?" I called out softly, not wanting to wake them if they were still asleep. No response. I tiptoed to the bottom of the stairs and listened again. The footsteps had stopped. The house was silent except for the faint hiss of the radiator. Telling myself I was imagining things, I went back to the living room. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I kept glancing at the doorway, half expecting someone to appear. About 15 minutes later, as I was attaching the final piece of the dollhouse roof, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were coming from the kitchen, just down the hall. My heart leapt into my throat. This wasn't my kids. These steps were too heavy, too deliberate. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a screwdriver, and crept toward the kitchen. The lights were off, but the faint glow from the living room spilled into the hallway. "Who's there?" I said, my voice shaking. No answer. I peeked into the kitchen. It was empty. The back door was locked just as I'd left it. But then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The cookie plate on the counter was empty. Not just a bite taken, completely empty. I stepped closer and saw crumbs on the counter. A glass of milk had been knocked over, a small puddle pooling at the edge. Panic surged through me. Someone was in my house. I backed out of the kitchen and grabbed my phone from the coffee table. My hands shook as I unlocked it and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. Someone's in my house, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Are you in a safe place? I think so. My kids are upstairs and I'm in the living room. Stay on the line. Officers are on their way. Can you hear or see anything unusual right now? As if on cue, I heard another noise. This time, it came from the front door. It was subtle, like the faint creak of hinges. I think they're at the front door, I whispered. Can you lock yourself in a room? I can't leave my kids, I said, glancing toward the staircase. Stay calm. Officers will be there in 5 minutes. Stay quiet and stay where you are. I held my breath, clutching the screwdriver tightly. The house was eerily quiet again, but I felt eyes on me. My skin prickled, and every muscle in my body tensed. Then, just as I thought the silence would suffocate me, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darted across the far wall, near the front window. My heart raced as I pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay hidden. Whoever it was, they were just outside the living room now. Suddenly, the soft sound of a door creaking open came from upstairs. My blood ran cold. The kids. I dropped the phone and bolted up the stairs, not caring about making noise anymore. Get away from my kids, I shouted, screwdriver in hand. I burst into Sarah's room first. She was still in bed, stirring groggily. Daddy? She mumbled. Stay here, I said, my voice firm but quiet. I ran to Timmy's room next. He was sound asleep, clutching his bear. No sign of anyone. Heart pounding, I checked the hallway and the bathroom. Empty. But then I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Wet footprints on the carpet leading from the stairs to Timmy's room, and back down again. I swallowed hard, my grip on the screwdriver tightening. Whoever had been in the house had just walked past my kids. Downstairs, I heard the faint wail of police sirens approaching. Relief washed over me. I ran back to the landing, hoping the noise would scare the intruder off. When I got back to the living room, the front door was wide open. Snow blew in, swirling around the footprints, leading out onto the porch and into the night. The police arrived moments later, sweeping the house and yard. They found no one. "Probably a burglar," one of the officers said. "Saw you were awake and decided to leave before things got worse." I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. Burglars don't eat cookies or sneak around quietly when the house is occupied. The officers left after making sure everything was secure, and I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, screwdriver in hand, watching the front door. When morning came, the kids ran downstairs, excited to see what Santa had brought. I smiled for them, hiding the fear still knotted in my chest. I never told them what happened that night. But every Christmas Eve since, I've double-checked every lock and left no cookies out. Some traditions aren't worth the risk.
The boat dropped me off at dawn. The sun was barely a smudge on the horizon, the sky a palette of muted purples and grays. The captain, a wiry man with a weathered face, handed me my bag with a nod. "Pick you up tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. sharp. Storm's rolling in late tomorrow, so don't lose track of time." I nodded, shouldering the pack. "Thanks. See you then." He didn't reply, just steered the boat away from the dock. Within minutes, the sound of the motor faded, leaving me in the heavy silence of the island. This wasn't a vacation. It wasn't even an escape. It was an experiment. For the past few years, I'd spent Christmas with family, smiling through awkward conversations and avoiding questions about why I wasn't married yet. This year, I decided to be alone. I turned to face the island, a crescent-shaped strip of land covered in dense, untamed vegetation. I'd rented a small cabin on the southern edge, the only structure here aside from a crumbling lighthouse that hadn't been operational for decades. The air was damp and carried the faint tang of salt. I tightened my jacket and started walking down the narrow dirt path that led to the cabin. The trees arched overhead, their gnarled branches twisting like fingers. The cabin wasn't much, just a single room with a bed, a table, and a wood-burning stove. I'd brought enough food for the night, a flashlight, and a book to keep me company. It felt almost romantic in a rustic kind of way. By noon, I'd settled in. I made tea on the stove and sat by the window, looking out at the choppy gray sea. The isolation was intoxicating. Then I saw it. A man. He was standing on the beach about 100 yards from the cabin. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the water. I frowned. The captain had told me the island was deserted. Was he a local fisherman? A lost hiker? I watched him for a few minutes, but he didn't move. It felt rude to stare, so I turned back to my tea. When I looked again, he was gone. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully. I took a short walk along the beach, careful not to stray too far from the cabin. The man didn't reappear. By dusk, the wind had picked up, and the temperature dropped sharply. I lit a fire in the stove and made dinner, a can of soup and a piece of bread. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the waves crashed against the rocks. I was reading in bed when I heard it. A knock. I froze. It came again, louder this time. I slipped out of bed, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. The knock wasn't coming from the door, but from the window. I turned the beam of the flashlight toward it. He was there. The man from the beach. I gasped and stumbled back. He pressed his face against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. His breath fogged up the pain. "Please," he said, his voice muffled. "I need help." My instincts screamed at me to lock the door and hide, but something about his voice, the raw desperation, made me pause. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Please," he repeated. "They're coming." "Who?" He didn't answer, just kept staring at me with those wild eyes. I didn't open the door. "Go away!" I shouted. He hesitated, then backed away slowly. For a moment, he stood there silhouetted against the dark trees. Then he disappeared into the night. I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. My hands shook as I double-checked the windows. I didn't sleep. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, crunching on the gravel outside. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window. 3 figures were standing in the yard. My breath caught. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring at the cabin. One of them was the man from earlier. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I grabbed my bag and slipped out the back door, keeping low to the ground. The woods were dense, but I knew the path well enough to navigate it in the dark. The wind whipped through the trees, drowning out the sound of my footsteps. I didn't stop until I reached the lighthouse. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar. I slipped inside and climbed the spiral staircase to the top. From the window, I could see the cabin. The figures were still there, circling it now. One of them kicked the door and it flew open. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, my heart hammering in my chest. Who were they? What did they want? I stayed in the lighthouse until dawn, too afraid to move. When the first light of morning broke, I saw the boat approaching the dock. I bolted down the stairs and ran to the beach, waving my arms frantically. The captain frowned as I climbed aboard. "What happened to you?" I didn't answer. I just collapsed onto the bench, shaking. As we pulled away, I looked back at the island. The cabin door hung open, swaying in the wind. The figures were gone. But on the beach, standing alone, was the man from the night before. He watched us leave, his hands in his pockets. And for the first time, I realized he was smiling.